The Great Depression pushed people to invent wildly creative food hacks just to get by. From whipping up cream with evaporated milk to giving bacon drippings a starring role in meals, hop on as we find out how people tried their best to make this nightmare just a little easier. Have you ever seen those posts on Instagram about what's a blessing or a privilege we don't talk about? I think having stews with proper ingredients is one. If you look at the Depression, these basic ingredients that we probably take for granted became so hard to get that people began to stretch all of their stews with water or flour wherever they could. These makeshift stews were the backbone of what kept most people going during the Depression, because they took the one resource that was still free and mostly available: water. If the crux of your dish is water, then it becomes a lot easier to prepare for a lot of people. Naturally, people were migrating from all sorts of places to live with their relatives in times like this too. It meant that people, for once, had to really think outside the box to see how they could get a dish done. It wasn't easy, and to be honest, by technical standards, they weren't really stews. Throw in some vegetables, though, and they become a meal that can feed an entire family at least. The Depression also had the benefit of being paired next to some of the worst things to happen in documented human history. I'm talking about ecological terror from the Dust Bowl, back-to-back modern warfare, the likes of which had never been seen in 2 world wars, and mass unemployment. It meant that people had to cut meat out of their lives almost entirely and substitute it with things like lentils and beans. Can you imagine an America where there really is no meat for you to get? Not in the stores, not from your neighbors, not even scraps left at the bottom of a can? It seems like some lucid nightmare that you may have dreamt up after a bender, doesn't it? Yet that was exactly the reality people were living with. Most good or even average cuts of meat had been stored away and rationed for soldiers during the war effort. They vacuumed protein, all those troops. Besides that, the prices for meat in general also skyrocketed beyond belief. Lots of people just weren't in the tax bracket that could afford its own poultry, game, and protein anymore. They adapted in other ways besides lentils and beans, but these natural resources saved dinner time for many people. So, about those stews I just talked about. They wouldn't add in just vegetables and potatoes. The entire idea was to not waste even a single thing. That means things outside our modern imagination too. For example, when's the last time you or I have used potato peels? Definitely not in recent memory for me. For people who were alive back then, though, they were literally adding in potato peels to their broths and stews. It was said that they were really good in regards to the amount of fiber they have. Have you ever had a conversation where a gym bro went off on you about micros and macros? You may have heard them mention fiber a lot. While I'm sorry for your wasted time if you've experienced that, I must say, they do have a point too. Fiber helps you be full for much longer and decreases your appetite. People were taking in everything they could to keep their appetites low, really. It's no wonder smoking became such a working-class related phenomenon during this time in America's history. One of the best ways for sustenance during this entire fiasco was easily corn. Cornmeal, in specific, was really helpful for the masses. This is because corn was one of the few crops that America could grow native to its own soil. It was also one of the few crops that was not experiencing massive amounts of failure during harvest. I really can't stress how bad this time was for the land as well, not just the people. The Dust Bowl was something that left all kinds of consequences on the face of the country. Crops seriously were never ever growing. People were trying to find their green thumb and get something going in victory gardens, which is a whole other concept we'll talk about later. But it wasn't really working. Cornmeal was the perfect thing to rely on for many reasons. First, you didn't run into these kinds of issues when you were making some simple cornmeal. Second, if you couldn't grow it because you just didn't live near any regions that had fertile land or were from the places struck by the bowl, then you could buy it for dirt cheap. Third of all, and this is the real kicker, there are actual detailed documents the size of mini novels that show you all the different kinds of recipes you can make with cornmeal. It also really helped that most of these recipes were really easy to make and adaptable to what you had on hand too. So, The next on our list is victory gardens, which I promised you we would talk about. When you think of the phrase victory garden, you might start to think about a bountiful paradise full of fresh harvests and the scent of liberty and conquest. However, this is exactly the opposite of what these are. Victory gardens were basically a band-aid solution that really helped people get by. These opened up an entirely new world of food for people, and their chances of actually being able to support all the mouths in their households opened up phenomenally. In their backyards, people had decided that they would start planting whatever kinds of crops they basically could, from stuff like celery, turnips, onions, garlic, and potatoes, to even things like corn. It meant that people could actually do two things properly once again. They could eat somewhat and find lots of vegetables and herbs to put in their food. Secondly, bartering had made a return in the modern era. After literally centuries since its last appearance, people actually began to trade items with one another for security. A few cloves of garlic in exchange for a ragged shoe, some extra lace and cloth in exchange for a potato, some hand-me-downs in exchange for celery. This was the common way of life for people back then. Another thing that got really popular was the entire concept of canned food. This was something industries would cash in on like an African gold mine later on in America's history and people's lives, but it made its debut on the grand stage here. During the Depression, canned food had become a lifesaver for so many different kinds of reasons. It was easy to preserve, which was the biggest one. This was always the kind of thing you would get for long trips, journeys where you'd go days without seeing stores, or for times like these. The stuff in those cans was built to last for months, and so were the cans. It also meant that people were able to get things pre-cut and made for them. If you got canned pineapple, for example, the fruit was already sliced into rings for you and put in juice. Get an actual pineapple, and you might save yourself a cent or two, but it would also take 10 times the work to get that sucker open. Energy was something people lacked, so whenever they saw convenience that they didn't have to spend a lot on, they'd take it. You could also get canned vegetables and fruit in just about anything. When people saw how much it helped preserve things, they started canning things and putting them in jars with airtight seals as well. The last thing, and I mean the absolute worst-case scenario in the Depression, was you letting something go to waste. It was a precious resource that you no longer had, and everything had to be used until the very last drop, because who was guaranteeing that the house could restock? Luck and nothing else. Another really popular part of the Depression diet and appetite was how people really took to making dumplings. No, seriously. I know nowadays we go out for them and they cost an arm and a leg and you're like, but they're just dumplings? And I'm right on board with that train of thought. Back then though, you gotta understand, flour was in a different position. Well, everything was. Things hadn't become that expensive, though they were definitely massively unaffordable by the standards of the people who were living in those times. The way people got to making dumplings during the Depression was by actually making use of things like all-purpose flour and water. They would end up making serviceable enough dumplings, and they would actually be really good to make for special occasions, or when you wanted to give yourself a little treat after finally being able to spare one too. It meant that people were eating at least something they enjoyed. It wasn't popular in just communities that had traditions around dumpling making too, but those communities outstretched their hand and taught people all the tricks they could to make better ones. Community living was a real thing back then. It had to be. People were simply more resourceful in numbers. Another thing that people did that really got some traction was that they began to use bones in their broths. The entire point behind using bones in your broths was that they were full of nutrition and actually added a lot of flavor to your overall broth. They made for cheap seasonings and were a pretty resourceful way to get some extra nutrition in your broth. During the Depression, people changed from throwing away leftover chicken and wings with a bit of nasty chunks of meat on them to consuming just about every single thing that was attached to an animal. Bones were no exception, and these bone broths were almost instrumental in surviving the winter for lots of people. Though they never fixed people's problems, they definitely didn't make them any worse either. People would often even reuse bones in broths instead of it just being like a one-and-done situation. So what do you think people did with the bread that was left over? Besides using stale bread in imaginative ways such as pudding and porridge, It meant that people used breadcrumbs as fillers too. This was helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, breadcrumbs actually make for an excellent binding agent. They're super good at holding the meat together, and this was necessary for more than a few reasons. You start making these makeshift meatloaves with limited ingredients, and you realize they actually don't hold together that well. Secondly, lots of the things that gave meatloaves their moisture were things like eggs, milk, and a good broth. Of course, milk and eggs were in direly short supply for most households in America during the Depression. Adding breadcrumbs was a way for your meatloaf to still keep some kind of moisture. Also, during the process, breadcrumbs would eventually soften and give the meatloaf a better texture overall. It meant that you only had stale bread without the crumbs, and now you're also going to be having meatloaf with it. Pretty good deal, right? Despite what you hear about the Depression every now and then, it actually was true that people started to make all kinds of gravy from drippings. It was a pretty practical way of making use of scraps and leftovers, after all. Drippings kind of mean the fat that people got from cooking meat. Every time they would cook any kind of meat, they'd always gather the fat drippings from it. This was true of beef, pork, chicken, and just about everything else that was considered meat. Food was really scarce during the Depression, and the budgets were even tighter. There wasn't room to waste anything and spend more money on buying packets of meat one after the other. After the cooking was done, people would take the fat and use that as a base for the gravy they'd eventually make. Some of that all-purpose flour we went over earlier would also help thicken the fat and give it this really nice texture that actually resembles something like a gravy. Plus, a makeshift sauce could be made that would be served with basic vegetables and herbs. Fat needs to be stored, though, and it was hard to store enough of it to make sure you had a good supply that would last you, but also wouldn't spoil. People had to get good at all kinds of things, and budgeting your resources, not just your dollars, was one of them. So, mock apple pie was the dawn of what you could call America's first experience with Frankensteining their food. Basically, the idea here was to mimic the taste and texture of a real pie. The actual original thing wasn't something people could really get back then, especially because of how hard it was to come by fresh apples. That was a fruit that America always had to import, and, well, there just wasn't a lot of that happening during this whole time period. Still, you have no idea of the importance of food in keeping morale up. A good meal has led armies to victory, so what can't it do for a starving population that just needs a win? Mock apple pie was made entirely out of reasons like this. The filling was made from soda crackers, and they would actually soak in all kinds of liquids from the filling. This would help them take a texture that really felt similar to apples, and when they would combine it even more with warm spices like cinnamon and brown sugar, then it would come closer to the real thing. Pantry staples like these, which were still somewhat available, were really helpful during the Depression. Around the time the Depression was really active, from the entire decade, powdered milk was such an essential go-to meal for people that it was impossible to not live without it. People did not have access to dairy, and I mean this as a fact of life. Nobody was drinking milk, like ever. You'd think something like that would be one thing the government could at least take care of, but God forbid you get your taxes worth, right? Anyway, powdered milk was at least a lot more competent than the two-party system at the time. Fresh milk had to be downed really quickly. Weren't feeling it? Just forgot? Too full? Too bad. If you don't want that bottle of precious, God-fearing milk to go to waste, you better buckle up and chug. Yet living like that sounds awfully exhausting when you pile on everything else people had to worry about, you know? It wasn't like that with powdered milk. No sir, this thing, you could just leave it in a cool little cabinet, not see it for months, pick it up, and get to work. Plus, most homes didn't have any kind of refrigeration, and this made issues of storage even worse for people. It was impossible to get by without relying on things like this. So just like the first item on the list, which was water for stews, there was another free resource that people just could never pass up on: dandelion greens. I can't tell you how big of a lifesaver these things were for the masses during the Depression. Dandelions were literally, and I mean this in every sense of the word, everywhere. They were in your city parks, they were in farms, they were on the wild plant growth past the sidewalk, on the hills, just about everything. It was one of the plants that grew in the wild that was also edible, and it cost literally nothing. People eventually started to forage on a national scale for dandelions whenever they could. You didn't need any kind of equipment or skills to make it work, and you also didn't need to do anything special for it to make it into a meal. You could straight up just eat the dandelion leaves. And sometimes, people used the flowers and roots too. As far as the roots went, they made good herbal medication for tiny Band-Aid fixes. The flowers, on the other hand, could be fried, and they could also be used to make jelly sometimes. The yellow petals of the flower were boiled in water, and that would actually help make a liquid. Once you combine that with molasses or brown sugar and some pectin, which was hard to get but could be substituted with other binding agents, you'd get a serviceable jelly out of it. So, in the very same way that people started to use drippings to make gravy, people also started to save the grease from the bacon they were cooking. Although bacon in and of itself was a rarity in most households, it would come every now and then as a part of government relief programs and food drive efforts. Some people would also manage to keep scraps and bits, or sometimes even entire strips. Those times were really lucky, and bacon was a prized resource. It wasn't that there was nothing that could substitute bacon, and hell, you even had some mushrooms that came pretty close to mimicking the texture and sometimes even the taste. It was just that nothing would give you the same comfort. Still, that didn't mean that was an excuse to let everything go to waste in just one use. People made great use of their bacon grease as an affordable and convenient substitute for fat, which was something they were sorely missing otherwise. They'd often even reuse the grease many times and try to get as much out of it as possible. It was good for frying and for making meals a bit more filling, but it did take a toll on the heart. So you hear hash, and it's like, what is that? Right? Hash in the context of 1929 onwards basically refers to a meal made entirely of leftovers. You could think of this as the dish that had cleanup duty, basically. At the end of the week, when all was said and done, and people had exhausted their supplies and there were only leftovers to tend to, people would repurpose it. On their own, leftovers are pretty stale and not really inspiring. Let's be honest, as resilient as people were, that kind of struggle takes a massive toll on you. Lots of people became indifferent to their own hunger, some even choosing to not eat rather than to stomach something they hated. Hash was a way to repurpose those leftovers that no one could find the stomach for. Also, that wasn't the case every time. Leftovers were a massively important part of the overall long haul that was the Great Depression. Even if people didn't like it, they sucked it up and ate it all the same. Still, that doesn't mean you have to make it any more troubling than it has to be. People would reuse corned beef or potatoes, mash them together, make hash out of it, call it a day, and move on. Rinse and repeat every week, and you last a day or two more than your budgeting originally allowed for. If you thought you needed work after a long shift, then you should really think about how bad people were craving it during the Depression. Now imagine if you were also denied that tiny little comfort at the end of your day. That cup of joe you've been craving since about 2 p.m. while your floor manager's been making life hell and nothing but. People had no idea how to go on without their daily coffee, and a lot of people actually fit the medical definition for a caffeine addiction too. It was just that common in everyone's day back then. The void that was left by coffee not being available thanks to disruptions in trade and people just not having any money was insane. Immediately, people got to finding substitutes. One of the best ones people ever came up with was roasting chicory and brewing coffee out of that. It wasn't exactly the same as coffee, but it came pretty damn close, and to the point that the difference started becoming something you could get used to. Never something to ignore, though, so people played it really soft. Chicory was easily attainable too, at least in most stores, so it meant that people could get it in their monthly grocery runs. Depression cake has a history to it. It was known as wartime cake, and it was also known as wacky cake, but what it was not known for was being well documented. There are lots of misrepresentations surrounding the history of depression cake. Some people think it started exclusively during the First World War, and some think that it wasn't actually used too much by people who were baking during the Depression. However, as always, there's a bit of truth to all of these claims and lots of exaggeration too. The things that made depression cake in particular stand out were the ways it used no eggs, milk, or any kind of butter. This is what made it stand out so much in a time like this. You walk up to people and tell them you can bake them a cake that doesn't take anything they can't afford and, in fact, probably makes use of stuff they already have. What you did need for this cake was shortening or vegetable oil. Next, some baking soda for leavening. Then, you'd take some cocoa powder, water, and lemon juice or vinegar. This would really help bring things together by activating the soda. As you can tell, that's a pretty inexpensive lineup of ingredients. In fact, it's probably the easiest recipe I've ever seen for a cake. Depression cakes were how people got around to celebrating anniversaries and birthdays and all kinds of things that people would usually celebrate with some kind of dessert. So, we've gone over lots of different things that helped people during the Depression, and at this point, you might be thinking that people managed to make a routine out of all of this. Another part of that routine was a turnip and a beet. Not exactly what your mind would first go to when you start thinking about a meal that could really help take the edge off and keep the family full, but people didn't have anything to work with. Plus, it wasn't all that bad. I think we just aren't used to appreciating our greens the same way people from the 20th century did. Turnips were pretty easy to appreciate back then too. Easy to grow, inexpensive, readily available, versatile, work well with all sorts of things, etc. It was really helpful to stockpile all kinds of ingredients that didn't need lots of kitchen appliances to make a meal out of, too. The government saw this and also pushed root vegetables like turnips and beets and encouraged the public to rely on them more. You could boil a turnip, you could even fry it, or you could bake it. People would use beets as a side in other vegetable-based dishes like vegetable meatloafs and casseroles, which were honestly pretty okay. It was a great thing to rely on and use as a filler because it meant that your really important and good stuff in the pantry was being avoided. This meant you could save it for when it really counted. People have found lots of different ways to use coffee grounds, but remember when I said they saved theirs and relied on chicory for brewing? Yeah, the other thing they did to make those supplies last longer than they had any right to naturally was reusing coffee grounds. So, coffee grounds had a lot of uses outside of just brewing. Once you made your cup of coffee, their use in that regard ran out, but that didn't mean you couldn't do anything more with it. If you actually take a look at what makes up a coffee ground, you'll find that it's really loaded with nitrogen. Plant growth in particular is something that deeply requires a lot of nitrogen to be successful. What was it that people got around to doing and doubled down on during the Depression? Oh, that's right, farming. Victory gardens in the cities and full-on farming in the rural areas. Coffee grounds were being used far and wide for how good they were at stimulating plant growth and helping the soil gain some of its spark back. Additionally, they killed 2 bugs with 1 harvest. You could fortify your soil while also ensuring that the scent of the coffee ground worked as a pest repellent, which it really did. In this time, animals were also migrating into areas they weren't used to avoid the effects of the bowl and the general chaos the country was in. They also took notice of all the new plants and really tried to get in there and mess them up. That's why people found so much use for these grounds even after they got their caffeine hit. One of the best things people were able to do for themselves during the Depression was their newfound dependence on vegetables. Some of that meant that people would start fermenting them in saltwater brine. Why did this work? Well, if you've ever dabbled in vegetable preservation, then you'll know that a brine is typically the best way to go about the entire thing. Fermented vegetables, especially things like pickles, could go for months on end without the need for any kind of cooling or refrigeration. Do you know how helpful that is? Canning with heat was effective, sure, but brining was a lot easier and a lot more potent too. People would shove large vegetables into any kind of jars or barrels and leave them to brine naturally, or they'd even throw in leftovers so they would last longer. The stuff people would grow from their victory gardens would almost always be brined so that it would last until the next crops grew. In this way, people managed to keep really limited pantries from running dry earlier than they needed to. Throughout much of the Depression and a lot of this video, you must have heard a lot about how people relied on bread. Stale bread in particular was something that helped people get by the toughest of times. People had also begun to make their own bread at home using leftover ingredients and basic staples like they usually do. You might have remembered me mentioning how often people were making bread pudding. Well, they'd take stale bread, some substitutes for sugar, and some basic spices, and then they would leave the bread to soak in milk if they had any. People also got into the habit of adding in dried fruits to these mixes. Plus, there were other ways besides just soggy pudding to make something out of stale bread. You could fry it, especially in butter or lard. Butter was pushing it a little, but you could still make do with lard and use it as a nice little breakfast. Then, of course, you could always toast the stale bread to give it some of its original texture back. This is how people added to their soups and stews, and they pretty much exclusively ate things like this to get by. That's how most homes made sure their bread didn't go to waste either. That on its own wasn't really going to fix people's massive issues with hunger, though. The thing people really needed wasn't another do-it-yourself way to get rid of leftovers and make something of them, but to keep their appetites as low as they possibly could. One of the best ways to do it, as I previously mentioned too, was to up your intake of fiber. Yet how is someone supposed to do this on a budget that's already been spread so thin? It gets really hard, and after a while, equally tiring. Oatmeal, and adding it to every single thing available, was a fine way to do this. Oatmeal was one of the most valuable players in any household's pantry and cabinets for many reasons. 1. It was cheap. This automatically puts anything in most people's top 10 during the Depression. 2. It had a lot of fiber, so between those soggy bowls of oatmeal, you would feel a lot less hungry. 3. It was chock full of protein, and nothing about the awful state of the country changed that. All that together made it one of the best fillers you could possibly use for a meal. Another type of pudding that helped in all regards? Rice pudding. Rice pudding wasn't just a source of nourishment for people, though, or a cheap meal they could go to. It was genuinely a source of comfort, and that was sometimes the real thing that people needed more than anything. Rice was inexpensive, and it wasn't really hard to get. I mean, besides the crop failures, people would use rice pudding for all kinds of things. They would use it to stretch things, they would use it to feed a family, and they would even use it during the holiday season. Plus, people would often cook their rice in batches too because it meant that the rest of your stock wouldn't go to waste. Leftover rice was often the biggest thing people used for rice pudding, but it also made a really good sweetener. People actually used their fruit peels for a lot more than you might first think. One popular hack during the Depression was to boil the fruit peels to make different kinds of jellies out of them. You heard something similar with the dandelion flour trick, but this is a bit more intensive. To do this, people used everything, from apples, oranges, and grapes to even bananas. Apples, whenever people could get them, were actually one of the best fruits to use for this. Any kind of fruit skin or core was collected too. Wondering why? Remember when we were talking about the same thing with dandelions? I mentioned something called pectin, which helped to make the jelly. These skins and cores were natural sources of it, and that's why it was important to collect them. You'd boil it all together, strain the liquid, and then return that to the pot, where you would add the sweeteners in a specific ratio. You'd boil it again for half an hour until it was just like jelly. Then all that was left to do was to wait for it to set. So, you might not have heard of this before, but it's also possible to get cream out of evaporated milk. It was one of the best hacks to use throughout the Depression. You'd chill the milk that evaporated absolutely thoroughly, and if you had a refrigerator, it was recommended to freeze it for a bit. Then, you would beat the mixture until you saw that perfect frothiness and thickness, which cream is so well known for. Whipped cream was often really good for sugar and vanilla extract, and it helped people enhance flavor and made the cream more solid overall. Some people would add vanilla to make it just a bit better, but that was a niche addition. This was what people did to cope with the fact that cream was never really available. They would actually just add in stuff like this to things that required cream, and it was close enough that people could forget about any differences and only focus on the similarities. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny Cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Speaking of supply being short, how do you think people started to deal with that problem? Looting and rioting at factories was not an option, and even if it was, it definitely was not a sustainable one. So people decided out with the Trader Joe's and the farmers' markets and with victory gardening in their own backyards. People started growing basic vegetables to supplement their diets and make simple food like soups and broths, which had made a comeback in the recession. They would grow basic vegetables and whatever the soil would allow, which first enabled them to eat, and second, helped them barter. If you did have a victory garden set up in your backyard, then you could effectively continue to barter with people, so it was a mutually beneficial setup. A lot of people became very secretive about the practice though, as they did not want everyone flocking to them for help when they could barely sustain their own household. Survival instincts bring that side out of anyone, right? The magic of salt pork was always something you could count on during the Great Depression. This heavily salted slab of fatty meat was a lifeline for families trying to stretch meals to infinity and beyond. Refrigeration was a luxury for many, and salt pork's long shelf life made it an indispensable pantry item. Salt pork wasn't just a food, it was an ingredient, a seasoning, and sometimes a main course. It flavored beans, greens, and soups, enough to give even the simplest dishes a little indulgence. When we were leaner, we'd fry up a small piece of salt pork and use the rendered fat to cook everything else. The result? A meal that had the feel of more meat than it actually had. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. The salt pork was so salty that it often had to be soaked or boiled before eating. It was affordable, versatile, and practically indestructible. A trifecta of survival during tough times. Salt pork is much more likely to appear in gourmet kitchens than in emergency pantries today. But back then it was a salty superhero, rescuing countless Depression-era meals from bland oblivion. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. One thing that was commonplace in stores, homes, and just about any place with sentient life in it were canned items and products that were high in preservatives. This is because there was an extreme focus on making food last as long as humanly possible, to the point that when people would run out of flour, they would use things like sawdust to bake their bread. So imagine how far canning as a concept went in those times. Everything that came in a can would soon be purchased faster than trucks could come to deliver the next batch. Remember how the PlayStation 5 released and everyone bought so many consoles that stores started having issues of people selling PlayStation 5s for higher than the retail price? Canned products were basically in that same spot in the Great Depression, because if you could trade somebody for a can of beef jerky, ham, corn, or peas, then you were essentially giving them the modern grocery equivalent of a medieval feast fit for royalty. People relied on these canned products not just to get by and to boost their food supplies, but to remember tastes from better times when they did not have to worry so much about every possible cent and every single bite. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Another way to cut down costs and help keep yourself warm in the harsh winters was to pick up skills like sewing or crocheting and make your own clothes. Plenty of people even took to repairing their wardrobe, fixing out any patches and making sure they look presentable, and more than that, that they feel comfortable and wearable. You have to think in their shoes for a second. This was a time where people were struggling to decide what food is worth spending money on, because you could only have so little food for what seemed like so much money at the time, if you were lucky enough to get there, while shops still had something to sell. There was just no way most middle-class or lower-class families were going on shopping trips or splurging for the new academic year. People recycled clothes, used cardboard and scraps of blankets to get what they owned looking better, and went on about their day. While they were not the best of times and certainly a very different past than our present day today, learning valuable life skills like that helped people later on when the recession did pass. If there was any silver lining to being in a situation like that, this was probably it. Hardtack, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtack was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtack was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. We have talked a lot about ways of saving income and exchanging items to not have to spend what you have, but what about ways of adding on to your finances? Families with apartments or houses that had extra living space would often take on boarders, renting them rooms for the night to earn some quick and easy money. Think of it as the prequel to Airbnbs. This actually worked a lot more often than it did not, as a lot of people found themselves out of a living situation with the Great Depression. We were not kidding when we mentioned that people risked homelessness pretty frequently, and not everyone managed to be safe from it. The ones that did not, they would live by getting room and board and hopping from place to place, as any reliable housing was something that just was not reasonable in the economy at the time, with real estate markets soaring higher than ever as inflation overtook the country. The people that were lucky enough to have had stable property before the Depression hit took full advantage of it, and we gotta say, it is a pretty clever idea. Over the course of this list, you will see a lot of communal camaraderie, even if it comes with a price. So maybe the ultimate lesson here is people only have each other when the going gets rough. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, Kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. Just as the standards for food became more broad and clothes became recycled, any unused scraps would not stay that way for long. People exhausted every single resource available to live in a very particular way, one that let them live with the least amount of worries. So old containers would get used since buying new ones was an unnecessary expense. Any leftovers, even days old, would be used to make sure food lasted as long as it could, and not even a bit of fabric would be left to sit on shelves and tabletops. Everything available in a home would be gathered, and families would brainstorm how to find some use for these items. You would be surprised at what people managed to come up with. You see, they did not have the budget or situational accessibility to be buying new clothes, so coming up with new shirt ideas or creating a cute skirt using leftover or old clothes was a good way to get by for people. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Suet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Suet was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Suet was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like Suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, Suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in Lard's clothing. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. One of the other ways people would use scraps, for example, is to make things at home that they otherwise would need to buy, such as homemade cleaning products. Instead of a proper dishwasher and soap, you would have vinegar or lemon juice or leftover baking soda mixed in water to do the trick. In fact, despite what you may think, people found that their dishes and surroundings were slightly cleaner than before they started using do-it-yourself methods like that. This practice became a habit that stuck around even after the Depression was over. It makes sense since the economy sure did not get better overnight, but when the fire was at its hottest, innovative solutions, like homemade products made for more than a few dollars saved. During the Great Depression, people realized pretty early on that saving money and cost-cutting on all types of grocery would be the most beneficial step to take. Creating homemade cleaning products made cost-cutting a little easier for people since buying dishwash or scrubbing materials was no longer a necessity now. People in this era truly had survival skills that need to be commended. This is not the only homemade solution on this list. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners. Honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener. It was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. More often than not, people would also end up selling these homemade goods to earn when they had some spare stock lying around that had not been used and did not need to be yet. Does that mean that there are no other things that could use a bit more money than you have right now? Of course not, and so selling any goods you baked or knit or any cleaning products you made would be sold to people who needed them. It was actually a pretty effective system and one of the ways that communities cared for and looked out for each other amidst all of the chaos in the early 20th century. Though the prices were modest and the quality often humble, it helped to have people you knew supplying what you needed. Think of it as the small businesses we have today that operate online, but back in the day, people would just sit at home and sell what they created. It was a pretty feasible business model in times of crisis, and many people benefited from buying cheaper homemade goods. Of course, pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days, but during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, a pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Of course, industrial and chemical production done in the comfort of your living room does not come for free, but it is not exactly a startup with a hefty investment. So how did people bring in the supplies? They did not. They recycled and reused materials as often as they could. Vinegar would be extracted and kept away. Oil would be reused several times a day. Candle wax would be gathered, melted, and reshaped. People got pretty creative once they realized how much they could truly get out of what they were buying and preserving if they just used it a bit more smartly, and the situation at the time definitely called for smarts. Tins and containers obviously got a lot more use. Even bones of any fresh food or meat would be used for broths. In this way, people managed to continue on getting by week to week. Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on. Especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though. since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Since we are talking about what people started cooking up in their homes, one of the most popular items that actually got used by the general public overall was tallow soap, otherwise known as soap made from animal fat, which people used lye solutions for. They would melt the animal fat and make it into tallow, which they then used for soap, and it was a great way of getting the most out of your protein in more ways than just building muscle. It also sold for a more than reasonable price considering that it was something that was easy to make and really good for you, so people took to it pretty well. Such homemade or easy-to-make soaps were a godsend during the Great Depression because general soap was considered a local commodity in grocery stores. This meant that alongside food and clothing items, the prices of soap also skyrocketed, making it inaccessible for the public. Luckily, soaps like tallow soap and homemade soap recipes were introduced. Tallow soap products are still used even today, so if you are a user, then maybe now you have some idea of where the idea was derived from. Evaporated apples came to the rescue when the orchard was empty and fresh fruit was a distant memory. These dried slices were a Depression-era treasure, lightweight, shelf-stable, and could take a plain dish and make it special. During the cold months, fresh produce was scarce, and a jar of evaporated apples was worth its weight in gold. Evaporated apples could be rehydrated in water and turned into pies, crisps, or cobblers, bringing the essence of autumn to winter tables. In addition, they were also a sweet addition to oatmeal, pancakes, or even savory stews. Evaporated apples were different from canned fruits. They didn't need sugar or preservatives and were an affordable and natural choice for frugal families. The resourcefulness of the drying process itself was a testimony. Apples were often sliced thinly, and families would place them out in the sun or hang them on strings to air dry. Even bumper crops didn't go to waste with this low-tech method. The flesh and the core of every apple were used. Dried apples are today a popular snack, but during the Great Depression, they were a symbol of ingenuity. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. One of the most familiar costs of life is the one of maintaining your family and supporting them. But in the 20th century, ideas like that just were not realistic enough to apply in life regularly anymore. Do not get us wrong. People sent what they could, but what they had was getting a lot lower by the week. Savings and investments were tanking for almost everybody, so people would keep their extended family with them all living under one roof. While that did mean that there were more mouths to feed, it also meant there were more people who could work and help around the house with things, so it was a balanced deal in retrospect for a lot of people. It saved a lot on costs a lot, as the biggest benefit was that you had your extended family's income coming along with them too, which helped keep one household overall more stable than two separate ones. It also meant that people individually were spending less on bills, since one light or one sink could work for multiple generations of a family. It did take a big toll on food supplies though, and not all of it was such a smart idea if you talk about pure pros and cons. But in an America where you did not know what tomorrow would bring or when a medical emergency might mean sudden hospital bills, it helped to keep family close. It's hard to imagine something as simple as eggs without a chicken coop, but during the Great Depression, powdered eggs were a reality. These dehydrated wonders became a staple in American homes, providing a protein-rich solution that didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration. Powdered eggs could sit on a pantry shelf for months, unlike fresh eggs, and that was a godsend for families facing uncertainty. When you mixed powdered eggs with water, you got something that was like scrambled eggs, kind of. Powdered eggs were bland and grainy, but when there were no other options, powdered eggs did the trick. They weren't just for breakfast. Home cooks used them in baked goods, soups, casseroles, and even puddings. Powdered eggs were versatile enough that even the least equipped kitchen could create quite a number of dishes without a single cluck in sight. Cheap powdered eggs were available, and they were a favorite item for government relief programs, which made them available to struggling families. Their utility extended beyond homes. Powdered eggs were shipped overseas to soldiers during World War II to make sure troops were nourished even in the most remote locations. Powdered eggs are now a must in emergency kits and camping supplies, but during the Great Depression, they were a sign of resilience. That wraps up the list of hacks used in the Depression era. Comment down below your favorite and don't forget to like and subscribe.